Joseph Stalin once stated, "Death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem." A chilling sentiment that would define his reign. From humble beginnings in the Georgian countryside to the helm of one of the world's superpowers, Stalin's rise to power was as dramatic as it was deadly. Following the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, a power vacuum formed within the Soviet Union. Amidst this uncertainty, Stalin, a man of seemingly unremarkable origins, began his ascent to the pinnacle of Soviet leadership. The consolidation of his power wasn't an overnight achievement. It was a calculated, ruthless process, marked by the infamous Great Purge. Political rivals, intellectuals, military officers, anyone perceived as a potential threat to Stalin's rule was systematically eliminated. The Great Purge wasn't merely a political maneuver. It was a horrifying testament to the lengths Stalin would go to maintain his iron grip on power. Yet it wasn't just the elite who bore the brunt of Stalin's ruthlessness. Ordinary Soviet citizens lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing if a misplaced word or a misunderstood action would land them in the dreaded gulags, the Soviet Union's notorious prison camps. In Stalin's Soviet Union, fear was the currency of control. Dissent was crushed, individuality was suppressed, and blind obedience was rewarded. It was a world where the state was omnipotent and the individual was insignificant. It was a world where life was cheap and death was merely a tool to preserve power. As Stalin solidified his rule, a dark era descended upon the Soviet Union, an era marked by fear, oppression, and mass death. This was the world behind the Iron Curtain, a world created by a man who believed that death was the solution to all problems. No man, no problem indeed. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would leave an indelible mark on the annals of world history. In the early 1930s, Stalin's decisions led to one of the most devastating man-made famines in history, the Holodomor. This tragic chapter began when Stalin introduced a policy of forced collectivization. The Soviet regime commandeered farms across Ukraine, Moldova, and parts of Russia, intending to modernize agriculture and boost grain production. Private farming was declared illegal, and the state seized all lands and livestock. Farmers were coerced into joining collective farms, and those who resisted were branded as enemies of the state and severely punished. However, the policy was disastrously mismanaged. The collectivized farms, governed by state-imposed quotas and inexperienced bureaucrats, were far less productive than the private farms they replaced. The little grain that was produced was exported to fund Stalin's industrialization plans, leaving the population with little to eat. And then, nature struck a cruel blow. Droughts and poor weather conditions further diminished harvests, but the Soviet regime remained unyielding. Quotas were not reduced, and the state continued to confiscate grain, even as the people began to starve. The scale of the tragedy was immense. Millions perished from starvation. The once fertile lands of Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, were transformed into a bleak landscape of death. The streets were haunted by the specter of hunger, with skeletal figures shuffling aimlessly, too weak to work or even beg for food. Stalin's government, in a chilling display of indifference, denied the existence of the famine both domestically and internationally. Relief efforts were obstructed, and the suffering was hidden from the world. The exact death toll remains unknown, but estimates range from 3 to 7 million lives lost. The Holodomor, a term that translates to death by hunger, is a grim testament to the horrors of Stalin's regime. It was a man-made disaster, a direct result of policies designed not to feed a nation, but to control it. Stalin's policies had turned the breadbasket of Europe into a land of death and despair. In the mid-1930s, Stalin initiated the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression and persecution. The Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror, was a dark and harrowing period in Soviet history. Its specter loomed over the entire nation, from the bustling urban centers to the most remote rural corners. No one was exempt from the widening net of Stalin's scrutiny. High-ranking officials, esteemed military officers, ordinary citizens, and even members of the Communist Party found themselves in the crosshairs of Stalin's paranoia. Stalin's regime was marked by a relentless quest for absolute power. Anyone perceived as a threat, however slight or imagined, was targeted, their fate sealed by the merest hint of disloyalty. The purges were not merely a campaign of physical annihilation, but also of psychological terror. They were a chilling demonstration of Stalin's absolute authority and his willingness to wield it without mercy. The most visible aspect of the Great Purge were the show trials. These public spectacles were designed to instill fear and demonstrate the consequences of dissent. The accused, often high-ranking party members or military officers, were paraded before the public, their confessions of treason extracted through torture and intimidation. These trials were, in essence, meticulously choreographed performances, their outcomes predetermined, their verdicts a foregone conclusion. Executions were carried out en masse, the scale of which was truly horrifying. The firing squads worked around the clock, their grim task a testament to the ruthlessness of Stalin's regime. The purge claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, a chilling testament to the lengths Stalin was willing to go to consolidate his power. The Great Purge was not merely a period of political repression, it was a systematic campaign of terror, designed to consolidate power and suppress any hint of opposition. It was a grim reminder of the human cost of absolute power, and the lengths to which a paranoid leader would go to maintain it. The Great Purge served as a grim reminder. No one was safe from Stalin's paranoia and thirst for power. Stalin's reign of terror continued into World War II, with both wartime atrocities and post-war repression. As the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, Stalin saw an opportunity. In 1939, he entered into a non-aggression pact with Hitler, effectively dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Yet this pact was short-lived. Hitler, ever the opportunist, launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, shattering their uneasy truce. In response, Stalin mobilized the Soviet Union for total war. However, his leadership was marked not by strategic brilliance, but by a ruthless disregard for human life. Soldiers were sent into battle without adequate training or equipment, often to face certain death. But the horrors of war were not confined to the battlefield. Back home, Stalin continued his policy of purging perceived enemies. In the shadow of World War II, countless ethnic groups were targeted for mass deportations and executions. Groups such as the Crimean Tatars, the Chechens, and the Volga Germans were forcibly relocated, their communities ripped apart and countless lives lost. As the war drew to a close, Stalin showed no signs of relenting. He tightened his iron grip on the Soviet Union, imposing a brutal regime of censorship, surveillance, and repression. The infamous Gulag system expanded, swallowing up anyone deemed a threat to the state. Intellectuals, dissidents, even returning soldiers found themselves caught in Stalin's web of paranoia and fear. Victory in World War II brought little relief to the Soviet people. While the rest of the world celebrated the end of the conflict, they found themselves trapped in a different kind of war. A war against their own government. The end of World War II did not mean the end of suffering, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in Stalin's reign of terror. Even as the world celebrated the end of the war, for the people of the Soviet Union, the nightmare was far from over. Stalin's death in 1953 marked the end of a reign characterized by brutality, oppression, and mass murder. His iron-fisted rule left an indelible mark not only on the Soviet Union but also on the world, a mark that would resonate throughout the annals of history. Stalin, the man of steel, ruled with an iron hand, transforming the Soviet Union from a rural society into an industrial and military superpower. However, this transformation came at an incredibly high human cost. The forced collectivization of farms led to the Great Famine, claiming millions of lives. The Great Terror, an intense period of political repression, saw countless more perish in gulags or face execution. The numbers are staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Some estimates suggest that under Stalin's rule, as many as 20 million people lost their lives, but the impact of Stalin's rule extended far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. He played a pivotal role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. His policies set the stage for the Cold War, a tense and precarious period of history that saw the world teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Even after his death, Stalin's shadow loomed large over the Soviet Union. His successors grappled with the legacy he left behind, a legacy that was a complex mix of fear, respect, and revulsion. His influence permeated every aspect of Soviet life, from politics and economics to culture and society. Stalin's reign serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that can arise when power is concentrated in the hands of a single, ruthless individual. His rule, marked by paranoia, terror, and widespread death, stands as a chilling testament to the destructive potential of absolute power. It's a chapter of history that we must never forget, lest we allow such horrors to be repeated, a reminder that we must never forget.